We ended last time talking about planetary nebula, at least mentioning a planetary nebula. William Herschel, looking at the sky with his telescope, saw several of these round nebulae, the round like planets, and so he called them planetary nebulae. The core of the dead sun, or sun-like star, is going to shrink down to be this tiny little speck. It's going to be very hot, 120,000 Kelvin. It's been giving off copious amounts of ultraviolet light, and that ultraviolet light is going to fluoresce or make glow the gases, excite the gases in the shell of stuff that was expelled at the last stage as the star was dying. And so that's going to be this big cloud of gas that we see glowing here, and it's generally called a planetary nebula. Now, Venus, if it survives, would have slid out from the sun. Earth would have slid out to almost 2 AU. It's obviously Venus may or may not survive everything we've talked about as the sun was dying. Earth will not be recognizable as Earth. It will be probably stripped down to the core by all the stuff spewing out, if it survives at all. And so it's not going to be really recognizable as our planet. And then it's going to cool off, because while this thing is very, very hot, it's also shrinking very, very small. And so it's rapidly losing the heat that had been given to the planets. And so Earth will eventually freeze. In the meantime, I want to talk about these planetary nebulae. They are fairly common. They are produced by Earth, or rather by Sun-type stars that die. And so wherever you find Sun-type stars, that would be G-type stars, or some early Ks, and then maybe some Fs. Now, the really high mass stars are going to behave a little bit differently. They're probably not going to make a planetary nebula. But you see these planetary nebulae in these star clusters right here. They're really a favorite for amateur astronomers to try to find the planetary nebula in one of the star clusters. They look slightly different. They don't all have this classic ring shape. Now the ring shape here is due to the fact that it's like a bubble, and as you're seeing it, you're actually seeing it thicker through the edges here, because as you're looking at it, you're seeing the edges thicker, and so that makes it brighter right there. Okay, but then why this sort of weird shape there surrounded by the smooth thing? What the heck is that? Okay, so what's going on here? Again, nice classic ring-shaped thing here. Okay, mid-solar mass stars die this way. We've identified almost 50,000 planetary nebulae in the Milky Way. Most of them die in tens of thousands of years. That means they don't really live all that long. Tens of thousands of years might seem a long time by human lifetime, but geologically or astronomically, history of the galaxy, that's nothing. So these things are very short, ephemeral sort of things in the history of the galaxy. They as a star dies, poof, makes one of these things, and then the star's gone. Okay, so it blows out into space. Kind of the classic idea is it blows out in all different directions here, and eventually forms into what we recognize as a planetary nebula. But as I said, something else has to be going on, because they don't all look alike. Many of these things look quite different from others. So why are they sometimes these odd shapes? Well, it has to do with several other factors. We have two main factors as to why these things look weird. One is that a lot of stars are part of binary systems. And if you have another star in the vicinity, the gravity and the stellar wind of that other star is going to have a dramatic impact on the formation of a planetary nebula. So that's one major constraint to why these things would not all appear spherical. There's another major constraint. and that is that stars don't all die exactly the same way. Remember the red giant wind we talked about? So the red giant wind would actually produce kind of a donut-shaped region around the star as it's dying. So when the planetary nebula is ejected, it's going to actually get pushed out in this hourglass or barrel shape. And so that would give you some of these shapes that we see. Okay, that'd be looking down the end of one of these things. And so that's another reason. So there's several different factors that go into why they're not all spherical. You can actually study them, different wavelengths of light here. You can see the way different wavelengths of light. Each one of those correspond to a different element, primarily giving off gas, giving off light. And so we can actually probe for a planetary nebula the different elements here, and we find is that the planetary nebula is, typically a little more complicated than we just made it out to be. That often, instead of one big poof, outer layers detach and blow into space, you sometimes get a poof followed by one last pulsation of what's left of the outer layers of the star, and then the second layer detaches. And so sometimes a planetary nebula can be made of multiple expanding clouds of gas. And so this again tells us that the universe is really a lot more complicated than we kind of make it out to be in an introductory class. All right, so recapping the death of a star. So it spends most of its life on the main sequence, leaves the main sequence when it runs out of hydrogen in the core, swells up to be a red giant. There's no fusion going on at this point when it's a subgiant, and then as it starts fusing in a shell, becomes a red giant. The core is not fusing, but it's fusing in a shell around the core. Then the helium flash happens. It starts fusing helium in the core and then hydrogen in a shell around it. That makes it a horizontal branch star. Then it runs out of helium to fuse, and then it expands to be a bigger red giant, and so that would be the asymptotic giant branch. At the end of the asymptotic giant branch, then what happens is, again, you got shells fusion, you got hydrogen shell fusion followed by helium shell fusion, and then eventually you just run out of fusion because it just can't keep this up. And then what happens is it becomes unstable. The core pulsates, the outer layers pulsate, the core starts collapsing, outer layers blow off into space, planetary nebula. So you got the planetary nebula spewing outwards. And then we have that core that's left. So that'll be our next topic of study here is the core. What's left of the core, rather. It's fused and fused and fused. Hydrogen to helium, helium to carbon. Some of the carbon goes into oxygen. Okay, so you have what's left is a big ball of carbon and oxygen, mostly carbon. And initially it's pretty darn hot. As I said, over 100,000 Kelvin, 120,000 Kelvin. But it's being held up not by heat pressure because it's not fusing anymore, and it just gravity shrinks it until degenerate electron pressure takes over again. Remember we talked about degenerate electron gas before, except now it's a degenerate electron gas with carbon. And so it's going to shrink pretty small. It's going to have about half the mass of the star still in it, and it's going to shrink down to about the size of the Earth. Still going to be pretty bright, about 20 times the current luminosity of the sun, but that'll be fading. And it's going to be pretty darn dense because you've shrunk something that's nearly half the mass of the sun down to about the size of the Earth. So what does that mean? It means if you had something that is about the size of a thimble, it would weigh about 1,000 tons, 1,000 metric tons, just the size of a thimble. So that gives you an idea as to how dense this thing is. So that'll be our next thing we talk about is what is that burnt out core.